Hi Narrate, Hannah here. You probably have heard by now we are attempting to take the upcoming election cycle seriously. We are trying to get intentional about how we engage one another in conversations, especially when we have differing points of view. How do we engage without being jerks? How do we have conversations and discussions in a way that allows us to remain in community? This is so important, and it may be worth practicing how we do this. We would love to invite you to our Estuary Gatherings 2.0. The first round was so successful, we are doing it again. Estuaries are places where freshwater and saltwater combine, leading to all sorts of unique forms of life. Basically, the idea behind estuary gatherings is that around 8 to 10 people come together in a living room. After enjoying dinner and a beverage, you'll circle up with a trained host. After everyone states what they'd like to talk about as it relates to politics or the election or any topic that's been on your heart and mind lately, the host will then lead the group into a conversation. The goal here is to real play what it's like to talk about hard things while maintaining relationship. These gatherings will run from 6 to 9 p.m. on Friday, November 1st. We would love for you to participate. Email me at hannah@narratechurch.org to sign up or for more information.
King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. Under the influence of the wine, Belshazzar commanded that they bring in the vessels of gold and silver that his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, so that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. So they brought in the vessels of gold that had been taken out of the temple and the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and began writing on the plaster of the wall of the royal palace next to the lampstand. The king was watching the hand as it wrote. Then the king's face turned pale, and his thoughts terrified him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. The king cried aloud to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, and the diviners, and the king said to the wise men of Babylon, "Whoever can read this writing and tell me its interpretation shall be clothed in purple, have a chain of gold around his neck, and rank third in the kingdom." Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or tell the king the interpretation. Then King Belshazzar became greatly terrified, and his face turned pale, and his lords were perplexed. The queen, when she heard the discussion of the king and his lords, came into the banquet hall. The queen said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts terrify you or your face grow pale. There is a man in your kingdom who is endowed with a spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, he was found to have enlightenment, understanding, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods. Your father, King Nebuchadnezzar, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and diviners, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will reveal the interpretation." Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king said to Daniel, "So you are Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah. I have heard of you, that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that enlightenment, understanding, and excellent wisdom are found in you. Now the wise men, the enchanters, have been brought in before me to read this writing and tell me its interpretation. But they were not able to reveal the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now if you are able to read the writing and tell me its interpretation, you shall be clothed in purple and have a chain of gold around your neck, and rank third in the kingdom."
Then Daniel answered in the presence of the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and let him know the interpretation. As for you, O king, the Most High God gave your father Nebuchadnezzar kingship, greatness, glory, and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. He killed those he wanted to kill, kept alive those he wanted to keep alive, honored those he wanted to honor, and degraded those he wanted to degrade. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he acted proudly, he was deposed from his kingly throne, and his glory was stripped from him. He was driven from human society, and his mind was made like that of an animal. His dwelling was with the wild asses, He was fed grass like oxen, and his body was bathed with the dew of heaven, until he learned that the Most High God has sovereignty over the kingdom of mortals, and sets over it whomever he will. And you, Belshazzar, his son, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. You have exalted yourself against the Lord of heaven. The vessels of his temple have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have been drinking wine from them. You have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know, but the God in whose power is your very breath, and to whom you belong all your ways, you have not honored. So from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Mene, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the scales, and you've been weighed on the scales and found wanting. Perez, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Then Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed in purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made concerning him that he should rank third in the kingdom. That very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old.
Took me a second to get used to beardless Steve. Does that have to do with your Halloween costume, I imagine? So I'd like to start by praying just to kind of settle myself, if not the rest of us. God, thank you. Lord, as we sit in this kind of on the cusp of another election, and we sit in the mystery of to what extent our own agency plays into all of that, and who leads us, and to what extent we can just rest in you and who leads in all that. God, I pray that, I guess my prayer would be that you would help us be non-anxious people when it comes to the political space, that we would realize your permission to be deeply engaged and yet see that your kingship is greater still. As for this morning, God, would you help us just experience you in the way that you have for us? I'm praying for my friends here who don't necessarily know you, and just the space that this is to experience you, and for those who do, and the opportunity to just oftentimes be reminded of things, but more than anything, Lord, just to be launched out into another week where we try to live faithfully with and for you. We love you. Amen. Good morning. So this morning, I want to start with that. You know that annoying game that's often played of like on a scale of 1 to 10? But I want to start there because there's something that I think I want to get to, and it's been really helpful to me, but there's a little bit of a runway to it. So you don't have to say this out loud. No one's going to ask you. You can talk about it at lunch if you want. But on a scale of 1 to 10, like how kind are you? And nobody gets 5. Let's just take away 5. And just like in your head, like just how kind of a person are you? I'm going 3. Today I'm 1. Or, okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how musical are you? Again, you don't get 5. And I'm negative 10 on this scale. Next one, on a scale of 1 to 10, how witty are you? Seth, you're a 10, so we're just going to tell you, you fall into that 10 quadrant. But seriously, can you like place yourself? And now here's what I really want to get to, and there's some runway to this. Maybe you've thought about this, maybe not. My suspicion is that for a lot of us, this morning's going to be one of those mornings where we're like, man, I got to think about that. But here's the question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how proud are you? I mean like self-conceit. I mean vanity. I mean arrogant. Like on a scale of 1 to 10, maybe even you might say narcissistic or caught up in yourself. Like where do you fall on that? And I asked that for this. Here's my thesis this morning. And I'm indebted to C.S. Lewis for this thesis. I'm also indebted to my own brokenness for this thesis. But here's a thesis for you to consider maybe this week as you reflect on what it means to be a husband or a wife or a parent or a friend, a coworker, a neighbor. Like what if so many of these virtues and ethics, so many morals, so many attributes, so many skills, we can pretty objectively look in the mirror and we can objectively like assess ourselves. Like, I mean, American Idol notwithstanding aside, right? Like most of us can look in the mirror and we have a pretty objective sense for how musical we are or how artistic we are. Probably most of us even have some sense of how kind we are or aren't, or how organized we are. But what if when it comes to self-conceit and human arrogance, pride, what we just read about in this story, like what if we're, but for the grace of God, like completely incapable of objectively assessing our own level of pride, our own level of arrogance? What if that's part of what this story is about, is this warning? Like we can see lots of things, but we can't see that. And I don't know about you, like I'm beyond the I want to do good because it's good. I want to do good because it works and I want to honor God. And so the question becomes why should we care? Like if the thesis is true that you very well are arrogant but don't know it, who cares? And I think there's two potential answers to that. One of them I've been working on myself a little bit, and it's this: you may never enjoy the fruit of your labor. You may be fully living into, or at least pretty darn close to becoming and living out your vocation and living the life God has for you. And yet pride, because it's so preoccupied on what's not, it's so preoccupied on comparison, it'll prevent you from ever actually experiencing the joy of your work, of your effort, and for those of you who follow Jesus, of your obedience. And the other thing is this: you'll be relegated to isolation and loneliness. Because this is one of those things we do objectively know, pride, arrogant people don't make very good companions or friends, but it's really hard to see it in the mirror. Now, I'll explain how I got there and where I see it in the text, but first, I want to share with you something C.S. Lewis said in Mere Christianity. And if you've never read Mere Christianity, we did a series from it last winter. If you're someone that's exploring faith, I can't think of a better resource for you. If you're someone that's trying to grow in your faith, I can't think of a better resource for you. We actually grabbed 10 copies of them back there and put them back there just because, if for no other reason, this one chapter, it's haunting. It's called The Great Sin. And I remember when I was looking at Mere Christianity again a little over a year ago for the first time in a while, I remember thinking the great sin is oh, sweet, he's going to answer. What's the unforgivable sin? It's not what the chapter's about. Here's the opening to the chapter. I now come to the part of Christian morals where they differ most sharply from all other morals. There is one vice of which no person in the world is free, which everyone in the world loathes when they see it in someone else, and of which hardly anyone, except Christians, ever imagine that they are guilty themselves. And he's not claiming that Christians are superior. He's claiming that Christians have the Holy Spirit helping them with this. I've heard people admit that they are bad-tempered, or they cannot keep their heads about girls or drink, or even that they are cowards. I do not think I have ever heard anyone who is not a Christian accuse themselves of this vice. And at the same time, I have very seldom met anyone who is not a Christian who showed the slightest mercy to it in others. There's no fault which makes a person more unpopular, and no fault which we are more unconscious of in ourselves. And the more we have it in ourselves, the more we dislike it in others. The vice I am talking of is pride or self-conceit. And the virtue opposite to it in Christian morals is called humility. And this is the C.S. Lewis at his finest right here. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to every other vice. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. Whew. There's a lot there, right? So here's the question. To what extent, if any, do you struggle with pride? And I wonder, I'm not the type of person who thinks that there's a single way to read a text. I think historical context is important. I also think showing up to the text and inviting God to speak to you devotionally is important. I think one of the lenses that we can look at this Daniel chapter 5 through is this very lens. What if the claim of Daniel 5, among other things, is you have two people, more or less made of the same stock, more or less with the same opportunities and potentials for downfall, two people who live in the same culture, two people who face the exact same challenge, one of which is destroyed by it, and the other becomes this hero because he comes above it. He rises above it. Let's just talk about Belshazzar. He's quite an interesting character. If you haven't been with us, we've been making our way through Daniel. We have one more week where we're going to cover the entire chapter. And then Leslie's been working really hard on November 10th. We said we were going to do this then, and we're going to do it. We're doing the entire Easter service. Like, we're going to do Daniel 7, but the music and the whole layout of the morning is the same thing we did on Easter, because that's the Sunday after the election, and we just kind of want to rest in God's kingship. So here's what's going on in Daniel 5. There's just a few contextual things that were helpful to me. First of all, just to kind of get your bearings, in 562 BC, that's when Nebuchadnezzar died. Remember, we're going BC, so there's that weird inverted thing. In 539 is when they tell us that this banquet happened, and we're not going to get into the history of why they know this, but some people know this stuff. But the third thing that's more implied in the text, you kind of have to bring the context, you have to go find the context for it, is that the Persian Empire was on the rise. So here's the context we think was going on that leads to this banquet. Belshazzar knew that the Persian Empire was marching towards his capital. He knew that it had crossed a key river. I forget the name of that river. He knew that many of his own kin and country folk were dying this very moment because he knew this massive army was headed for the capital. And in response, he threw a party. Now, there's a fork in the road there where you kind of have to pay your fee and make your choice. Some scholars think that the party amounted to that, like, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die. I'm not persuaded by that one. It might be because it doesn't preach as well. I'm not sure. The one that I'm persuaded by, and it seems to be the more common read, is that Belshazzar, he knew that he had, some estimates are he had a 20-year supply for every man, woman, and child in the city of food and water. He had great confidence in the walls around his city. He was obviously somewhat not interested or concerned about those outside the walls, but he threw this party as this testament of the power of his kingdom and the power that he had in his resource. The idea was they were going to party while Persia marched on the city, and when they arrived there, they'd have to wait for 20 years before they had any effect on the kingdom. It's bold. And he goes so far, you probably picked up on this. In chapter 1, we're told that Nebuchadnezzar brought the sacred vessels from the Jewish temple and put them in the museum. And Belshazzar, it's not really his dad, but that gets into some dynamics elsewise. It's really what we're getting at is the next generation. Belshazzar has the audacity to not just take him out of the museum, but like use him for beer pong. And of course, the story ends somewhat climactically or anticlimactically. Not only does he not make it 20 years, he dies that night. And then there's Daniel. And I wonder, what if Daniel is this exemplar of humility? And I think the challenge is this. What if Daniel faces the same temptations, the same pitfalls, the same opportunities? What if Daniel is this emblematic person who by the grace of God did some work? And how does Dallas Willard say that? Of like, God will have to do it, he'll have to do it in you, but he won't do it for you. The mystery that is grace. Because think about Daniel. What did Daniel do? Well, the first thing that stands out to me is he was forgotten. And you might have picked up on that in the story. Daniel, if you haven't been following the story, has been this key figure who led to these remarkable things in the kingdom, so much so that he was instrumental in bringing their king to faith. And Nebuchadnezzar tells that story in Daniel 4. And now, we get to chapter 5, 23 years later, and Daniel, they forgot all about him. He went from this icon of his culture to unknown, unimportant, and invisible. And the way the story ends, it's not like his effectiveness was gone. Like he wasn't sitting in some room somewhere because his mental faculties were gone. He wasn't at a condition in a season of life where he didn't have anything to contribute. Like the way the story ends says, no, he still had a lot to give. He still had a lot of energy, a lot of intellect left, a lot of credibility. What stands out to me is that Daniel was the type of guy who could just be forgotten, just moved to the sideline. And then, I don't know, this is one of those like, maybe I'm bringing this to the text, but I think it's there. There's this offer of reward. And I just love, maybe I see Daniel being more spicy than he is, but I love this response. Then Daniel answered in the presence of the king, "Let your gifts be for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else." It seems to again be tipping that what animates Daniel maybe isn't the same thing that animates me or you or most of us at our worst. He's not animated by human approval. He's not motivated by popularity and the things that come with it, money, sex, and power. There's something else that drives the why behind his what. What if, I don't know why my emotions are at the surface this morning, well, maybe I do, but what if this is the story? This is the story you wake up every morning as you live your life. Like, we know the ethos of people who, this is your church, this is your community. Like, you're driven, you're passionate, you care deeply, you want to matter. There's this desire for significance and meaning. The details matter to you. Like, there's this pull towards excellence. And yet, I have this memory of one time I was walking with my friend Jack on Mount Helena, and he was talking about some ways that he was helping his adult children, and I said, Jack, how do you know that you're not enabling your kids? And I'll never forget, it was him and Dr. Bruner and I, and he goes, oh, Adam. Said only like a brilliant guy who's lived a lot of life could say it. Oh, Adam, the line between enabling and Christian charity is razor thin. And I think the line is razor thin between like properly wanting to be great and being an egotist and being destroyed by it. So here's my confession. 3 years ago, some friends and I, if you've never read this book, I just beg you to read it, and I know I overplay that card, sorry. But we reread a book by Richard Foster called The Celebration of Discipline. It's this brilliant book. I think it's the second book I ever read as a Christian, as a 19-year-old. It's this, part of what's great is you don't have to read the whole book because every chapter is its own kind of iteration and explanation of 12 spiritual practices. We read this as a group, and just to kind of put in context as where I placed this book, I started this thing last year where every Christmas I'm giving my kids a book for Christmas. It's like the gift that nobody wants. And can anybody guess which one I gave them last year? I gave them The Divine Conspiracy. Like, what else would you give your children? And I have no designs on them reading it tomorrow. I just want them to have this library of books that when I'm dead or whatever, and they're trying to whatever extent they care to understand what animated me in my faith, I want them to have this library. Well, the one I'm buying this year, spoiler alert, they're not here right now, is going to be a celebration of discipline. There's 2 chapters in there that are just, the last time we read it, stood out to me quite a bit. One is this chapter called Submission, which we've talked a little bit about, and it is so uncomfortable. In fact, as I was preparing this week, my spiritual practice, one of them for 2025 is going to be, I went into my calendar this week and scheduled a time once a month, every month in 2025, where I'm going to read that chapter because I'm so terrible at it. And it has nothing to do with marriage, submission. The other one was this chapter called Confession. And I don't know if you've read it, and nor do I know what your background is with confession, but what I remember him saying, like he's a Quaker. He's a Protestant Quaker, so his view of confession is going to be much more like everyone in this room, or most everyone in this room. And he allows in the beginning of the chapter, like, because of the cross, we all have this opportunity to come before God personally and privately and even inaudibly and confess our sins to God. We have that. And then he says, and this is one of those things like, I haven't been able to outrun it, but I haven't done anything with it, or at least hadn't, because then he says, but I wonder if in our permission and freedom, we aren't at times missing something by not confessing things to other humans. And what stood out to me in that, and there's been then this like, man, what would it look like for a group of people who meet semi-regularly, this is the way I've been thinking about it, to just have part of that time go like, hey man, here's some of the crap. Not in the like, what was that thing called, promise keeper, like hold you accountable kind of sense of the word, but really the point of confession is to have someone else say to you, in the name of Christ, you're forgiven, you're free. So I carried that, there's a big runway to this context. I'm currently taking this class right now, along with some friends, and a couple weeks ago, the topic was confession. We're going through the sacramentals, things like marriage and burial, and confession was one of them. And we had to read this book, or I had read it before, but had to reread this chapter by a guy named Michael Ramsey. He was a Canadian pastor. And he takes that thinking to another level, and he says, in this, like in our language, we'll often say, I can't forgive myself. And Michael Ramsey says that might actually be the cue for when you should actually, instead of saying it that way, that might be the cue for when you need to say it to someone else. Like, because you need more oomph behind your confession and forgiveness. So I missed the small group thing. We do small groups every other week from this class. The last one I had was the Monday that Chris left, and I just laid on our living room floor and stared at the ceiling and was tired after Chris left. Not literally, but it was just exhausting. I woke up, it was supposed to be that Monday night. I woke up Tuesday morning and immediately was like, oh no, I forgot that meeting. Now I'm that guy. I always judge that guy. I don't want to be that guy. I missed the meeting. And so I jumped on the WhatsApp stream because that's where they communicate. And the guy who leads it, his name is Matt. He's this great guy, and I think he's in Austin. And he did the thing I refuse to do. I'm like, you can miss the meeting, but don't ask me for the summary. I think that's so annoying. He gave the summary. And part of what he said is, hey, and I challenge you guys, this is beyond the curriculum, beyond the assignment. I challenge you guys to schedule a confession with somebody between now and the next time we meet. And my first response was, I ain't doing that. Like, I think it was more like, go pound sand. I'm not doing that. But then I started to play this thing out in my head of like, and I don't know why, but I started to play it out in my head of like, well, if I was going to do that, what would I say? Like, what would I confess? And quickly what I realized was, because my rationalization is I do confession all the time, and I do on some level. Like, even the liturgy I use in my quiet times, it starts with this confession. Like, I'm okay at that. But what I realized is when I confess to God, it sounds something like blah, 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 blah. Like, it's completely inarticulate and non-specific. It's just like blah, blah, blah. But then when I started imagining sitting across from another human and confessing my sin, there was this challenge to like, what would I say? And at first I was like, well, maybe I would confess that I'm kind of a coward because I deal with fear. And I was like, well, that would be accurate, but I kind of, stuff just kind of comes and goes in your head, and I sat with it for a couple of days, and I was like, no, and then I was like, well, maybe I should confess that I probably enjoy a beer too many days a week. And I'm like, yeah, no, definitely not going to confess that one, though I probably should. Not to make light of that. And then this third thing happened. And the third thing was this. So Chris was here. Some of you know that. All of you know that. We did this thing at my house on Friday night with the staff and the council where we did this kind of Q&A thing. And part of what happened in the Q&A was very quickly what I figured out. Like, I'm kind of picturing like, Chris and I are going to answer questions. And then pretty quickly it became clear, it's like, no, Chris is going to answer questions. And this is not some passive critique of him. The opposite's true. I didn't necessarily totally understand the details of it, just kind of went with it. And then Sunday we did the thing at Brothers. And again, in my head, I'm like, oh, we'll do this thing, like we'll bounce things off each other. And pretty quickly it was like, no, there'll be no bouncing. And again, I am not in any way insinuating a critique of him. Like, I think it was, you all know what I have to say. Like, I get it. And then, as I was processing that more, I was like, why, like, what happened there? Because Chris and I's friendship only grew. I only have more respect for him. I just talked to him on Friday, so there's nothing passive there. And then I started, then all of this confession stuff happened. And I went, oh, I think I know what that was. I think that was pride. I think I've got my own story. I think we've also planted a church. I think we've also done things. I think. And then I realized, and I just processed this with Chris on Friday because I'm such a needy person, was this like I've worked next to 5 talent people. Have you? I know what those people look like. And he's one. And there's this thing that happens in us. Whew. What if we're all proud? And what if there's this thing that happens? So I got to meet with a friend on Friday, and he's like, so what do you want to confess? And I was like, well, let me tell you. And yet, he's a fellow pastor, and he gets it. And he goes like, whoa, yeah, okay, this is helpful. And it was awesome. Here's a couple questions. This is from C.S. Lewis. In case you're going I'm not proud. Look at this one. How much do I like it when other people snub me or refuse to take any notice of me, or shove their oar in me, whatever that means, or patronize me, or show off. Or how about this one? Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only having more of it than the next person. There's a couple places where this lands for me. It's basically this, what if this is a warning to us all? Because part of what's going to happen, we know what's going to happen. As we move into the home stretch of the election, you know how you can justify not liking a candidate? By calling them an arrogant power monger. That would be ironic, wouldn't it? Because oftentimes the only difference between them and you is they have more of it than you do. And I wonder if part of what we have to be careful in this process is recognizing, whoa. Like, we all have that. Some of us are just better at realizing it than others. And then there's this other thing. I don't know about you. I've watched kids play baseball for 10 years now, and it's fun. And I would say after 2 years, and this you could apply this to probably just about any activity, including your work. After a couple years, you go like, that kid has the potential to be all-state, and that kid has the potential to contribute and play all the way through his varsity year, and that kid will struggle to make the team, but might contribute, and that kid will never make the team. And now I've watched these kids go from 8-year-olds to 18-year-olds, and the other thing that I've watched is some of those who are like the 5-talent kids. I mean, they're baseball players in Montana. None of them are 5-talent kids, but some of them relative to the rest of them who are like the stars, some of them seem to really enjoy it, and others of them seem to be miserable. And then you could say the same thing about the middle-of-the-road kids. Like those, and they're not middle of the road. Like to play a varsity sport in Montana, that's a big deal. To be a starter on that, big deal. And yet some of them, they seem to really be able to enjoy that, and others of them, they're miserable. And I've even seen kids who are like the 12th kid on the team, or in the case of Legion, the 18th kid on the team, who seem to actually really enjoy the experience. And then I've seen others who are miserable. And I think we can turn that whole lens around and talk about you and your vocation. Like the reality is, you have almost no control. 5-2-1. You don't pick that. And at the end of the day, the gospel says, and it doesn't matter. You're a steward. And stewardship is about like living into who God calls you to be. So I wonder, what if chapter 5 of Daniel, it just warns us that left to ourselves, we'll be miserable, lonely, and frankly, accomplish very little. And then there's a Daniel who, like Joseph and Moses and Mary and so many others, just seems to live in the rhythms of God's invitations. I'd like to pray for you. Lord God, the danger here is that this would be about me, and that's clearly not my intent. But it does seem like, Lord, this is such a pervasive, all-encompassing issue for all of us. And Jesus, the funny thing is, as C.S. Lewis says, like we can all smell arrogance from a mile away, but we can't see it in ours. And the call you give us, the invite you give us, is to be your image bearers in this little tiny sliver of time that is ours. And so, God, I pray for my friends who have high ambition and high calling, and this tension of what constitutes excellence and yet just surrender. We love you, Lord. Amen.
If you'd like to learn more about Narrate Church, find us online at narratechurch.org.
You can also look us up on Facebook or Instagram. Thanks for listening.